The aliens finally cornered the human they hunted. They felt sorry for him. The moon had no name that mattered anymore. The Kael'th survey charts called it Designation 7 Theta, a frozen rock orbiting a gas giant nobody had bothered to colonize, and for 3 weeks it had been the last place in the galaxy that mattered to 11 hunters and 1 human. Sergeant Raul Dosketh lay flat against the ridge of a crater wall, his suit's chameleon plating shifting through shades of gray ice, and watched the wreck below through a scope that could count the rivets on a starship from 40 kilometers. There weren't many rivets left to count. The humans' transport, a stripped-down courier vessel with military modifications nobody back at command could explain, had come down hard 3 days ago, cutting a black scar through the ice that was still visible from orbit. Half of it had sheared off on impact. The other half sat crumpled against an outcrop of frozen methane, venting a thin trail of vapor that froze instantly in the vacuum. No life signs from the wreck. No power signature beyond a trickle. And somewhere out there, on foot, in a moon with a surface temperature of -190 degrees, was the thing they had been chasing for 6 weeks across 4 systems. "Report," Raul said over the squad channel. "Nothing new," came Yoon's voice, flat with exhaustion. She was 2 kilometers east, dug into a fissure with a rail cannon that could punch through starship hull plating. "Thermal's clean. If he's alive out there, he's colder than the rock." "He's alive," Raul said. He said it with more certainty than the sensor readings strictly justified, and he was aware, even as the words left him, that certainty had become something of a liability where Elias Reyes was concerned. Certainty was what had cost them a shuttle above the Corda refinery. Certainty was what had let the man slip an entire blockade at Perrin Station while 11 trained hunters watched their own tactical models insist it wasn't possible. If there was one lesson 6 weeks of failure had actually managed to teach him, it was that whatever assumptions the squad walked into this crater with were exactly the assumptions least likely to survive contact with the man they were hunting. He didn't know how he knew. Call it 6 weeks of pattern. Call it the particular, maddening consistency of a creature that should have died 4 times over and kept not dying. The human had lost his ship, lost his weapons cache in an ambush outside the Perrin asteroid belt. Lost, according to the last biometric read, they'd managed to steal off a damaged sensor buoy. Most of the blood in his left leg after a near miss from a plasma round 2 days ago. And still, every time the hunting party closed the noose, they found an empty position and a trail leading somewhere else. 6 weeks. Raul had stopped counting the days somewhere around day 30, when the numbers had started to feel less like a timeline and more like an accusation. It had begun on Perrin Station, a mining waypoint on the edge of contested space, with a tip from a freight broker who'd taken one look at the reward figure attached to Elias Reyes's file and decided loyalty to a human client was worth exactly nothing against that many credits. The first contact had gone bad within minutes. Reyes had been faster than anyone expected, faster than the file's medical baseline suggested a wounded man had any right to be, and by the time Raul's squad had fought their way through the station's lower docks, their target had already stolen a courier vessel and burned a hole through the blockade wide enough to vanish into the shipping lanes. The second contact, 11 days later, above a gas refinery in the Corda system, had cost them a shuttle and very nearly Coral's life when Reyes had put the courier vessel through a maneuver that should have torn the hull apart and instead had simply outflown 3 interceptors built specifically to run him down. Raul had watched the recording afterward, alone in his quarters, more times than he wanted to admit, trying to understand how a single pilot without military-grade Kael'th reflex augmentation had threaded a debris field at a velocity their own simulators rated as, at best, an 11% survival probability. By the third contact, in the asteroid fields outside Threna itself, a system Reyes had returned to inexplicably when every tactical model said he should have run in the opposite direction. Raul had stopped thinking of the chase as a manhunt and started thinking of it as something closer to a war of attrition against a man who did not seem to value his own survival highly enough to behave the way a fleeing target was supposed to behave. He ran when he could. He fought, briefly and with terrible efficiency, when he had to. And every time the noose tightened, he found some way to slip through a gap nobody on Raul's team had accounted for, until the squad's collective nerves had worn down to something brittle and superstitious, the particular exhausted dread of hunters who have started to suspect, against all evidence and all training, that their quarry might simply be better at this than they were. This was the reason General Vosktherd had assigned his best team to a single target instead of a war front. This was the reason the Caliph Assembly had authorized a black budget large enough to field 3 dropships, a stealth cruiser, and enough ordnance to level a city, all to bring in one man. Because the man wasn't just a man. He was Commander Elias Reyes, and 8 months ago, on a diplomatic world called Threna Vale that had never done anything to deserve what happened to it, Elias Reyes had, according to every account the Caliph had gathered, single-handedly ended the lives of 43 Caliph soldiers and walked away with a limp. Raul had read the reports. He'd watched the drone footage, grainy and half-corrupted, of a single human moving through a garrison compound like a knife moving through wet paper. He'd seen the after-action photographs, and he had made himself look at every one of them, because if you were going to hunt something, you owed it the respect of knowing exactly what it was capable of. What Threna Vale had taught the Caliph, more than anything else, was this: humans, when cornered, did not behave like anything else the Caliph Assembly had ever fought. They did not surrender. They did not negotiate from a position of loss. They got faster and colder and infinitely more dangerous the closer you pushed them to the edge. Which was, Raul thought, watching his squad's positions blink green across his HUD as they closed the perimeter around a 15-kilometer search grid. Exactly why nobody on this mission was going to be sloppy about how they finished it. "Movement," said Corporal Thess, from the south ridge. One heat signature, low intensity, coming up out of a lava tube 200 meters from the wreck. Raul's pulse, 4 chambers cold-blooded by ancestry, engineered over 3,000 years to stay level under fire, ticked up anyway. "Everyone hold," he said. "Nobody fires without my mark. We do not repeat Threna Vale. We take him alive if it is possible, and we take him careful either way. Report positions." 1 by 1, 10 voices checked in. Yoon in the fissure, Thess on the south ridge, Van and Coral flanking the wreck itself, close enough to storm it if the human doubled back. The rest spread in a loose net across the crater floor, weapons hot, nobody breathing louder than the recyclers in their suits. Raul watched the heat signature crawl out of the lava tube and go still. It didn't run. It didn't reach for a weapon. It just knelt there in the red-black dark of the tube mouth, one shape against the ice, and did not move again. "Thess, report," Raul said. "Is he down?" A pause. Then, quieter than protocol required, "Sergeant, you need to see this." The image that came through on Raul's HUD a minute later was not what 6 weeks of pursuit had prepared him for. Elias Reyes was folded against the tube's mouth like something that had given out mid-motion and simply stayed where gravity put it. His suit, what was left of it, had been patched so many times with sealant foam and scavenged plating that it barely resembled standard human EVA gear anymore. The left leg was wrapped in a crude tourniquet above a wound that had clearly gone untreated too long. Even through the suit's insulation, Raul's scope picked up the telltale mottling of frostbite creeping past the tourniquet line. His right arm was cradled against his chest, immobile, the shoulder joint sitting at an angle that made even Raul, who had broken enough bones on enough species to know the shape of real damage, went slightly behind his visor. He was not reaching for a weapon. He did not appear to have one. His remaining hand, the left, was pressed flat against the ice, not for balance, Raul realized after a second look, but because it looked like the only way the man was staying upright at all. "Sergeant," Yoon said, her voice careful now, stripped of the flat, professional exhaustion from before. "That man has been walking on a shattered leg through a methane storm for at least 2 days. His suit's life support is reading in the red. He should have died 6 hours ago by every metric we have." "He's Reyes," Thess said. "Threna Vale wasn't 6 hours of hard luck. It was 43 dead in under an hour. Don't let the leg fool you." "I'm not fooling myself," Yoon said. "I'm reading a body that's dying in front of us. There's a difference." Raul said nothing for a long moment, watching the still shape on his HUD. 6 weeks. For systems. 43 names he had made himself memorize, because a hunter who didn't know exactly what he was avenging wasn't fit to carry the weapon. And now the thing at the end of it all was kneeling in the dark with a shattered leg. Not running, not fighting, just waiting. It didn't feel like the end of a hunt. It felt like walking in on something private that hadn't been meant for an audience. "Converge," Raul said finally. "Slow. Weapons up, but do not fire unless he moves against us. Yoon, hold the fissure as overwatch. Everyone else, tighten the net. I want eyes on him from every angle before anyone gets within 20 meters. They moved the way the Kael'th military had trained them to move for a decade. Silent, coordinated, closing a net so tight a shadow couldn't slip through it. Rahl had run this exact formation 11 times on 11 different worlds, against enemies that ranged from disorganized insurgents to, once, a Threll warbeast the size of a transport shuttle. He had never once, in 11 years of service, felt his hands this unsteady on his weapon's grip as he came down off the ridge and crossed the crater floor toward a single unarmed man who was, by every reasonable measure, already beaten. 15 meters, Reyes lifted his head. Rahl stopped walking. Through the scratched, frost-rimed visor of a suit that had no business still holding pressure, a human face looked back at him, hollow-cheeked, lips cracked white, eyes sunk so deep with exhaustion they looked bruised. But they were open, aware, tracking the 11 armored shapes closing around him with a kind of exhausted, almost clinical patience, the way a man watches whether role in that he has already decided he cannot outrun. He did not reach for anything. He did not speak. He simply watched them come, and something about the stillness of it, the total absence of the desperate, cornered violence every briefing had promised, made Rahl's throat tighten in a way he did not have a word for in his own language. Reyes, Rahl said, because someone had to say something, and the silence had gone on a beat too long. Commander Elias Reyes. The man's cracked lips moved. It took him 3 tries to get sound out, and when it came, it was barely above a whisper, run through the suit's translator in a flat, mechanical approximation of a human voice that had clearly not spoken aloud in days. Yeah, he said. That's me. They didn't kill him. Nobody, in the end, gave the order, and nobody among the 11 hunters standing in that crater seemed inclined to ask for one. It was Van, youngest of the squad, barely 2 years out of officer training, who had lost a cousin at Threnna Vale and had said, more than once during the long weeks of pursuit, exactly what he intended to do when they finally cornered the man responsible, who broke the silence first and not with the fury Rahl had half expected. Sergeant, Van said quietly, weapon still trained but his voice gone strange. He's not going to make it another hour without medical support. Look at his life signs. Rahl looked. Van was right. Whatever fire had carried Elias Reyes across 200 meters of lava tube on a shattered leg had burned down to embers, and the embers were going out. It should have been simple. The mission parameters were clear. Capture if possible, confirm kill if not. Either outcome closes the file on the most costly manhunt in a decade of Kael'th military history. Nobody would have questioned a report that Red Target succumbed to injuries prior to extraction. Nobody in that crater, watching a man who had killed 43 of their own kneeling in the dark with nothing left to fight with, would have needed to lie about how it happened. And yet, Rahl thought of the after-action photographs from Threnna Vale, the neat rows of names he had made himself memorize, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that the fury he had carried through 6 weeks of pursuit had gone somewhere he couldn't locate anymore. What was left in its place was something closer to what you felt looking at roadkill on a highway. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but a kind of tired, unwanted recognition that whatever had happened here, it wasn't going to be improved by one more body in the snow. Get the medkit, Rahl said. Stabilize the leg. Thess, call the shuttle down. Tell them we have the target and he needs immediate trauma care or he dies before we get him back for processing. Nobody argued. That, more than anything, told Rahl he'd made the right call, or at least the call his squad, exhausted and hollowed out by 6 weeks of chasing a ghost through the cold, was willing to live with. Yun came down off Overwatch to help Thess with the leg. Van kept his weapon up but had, Rahl noticed, lowered the muzzle a few degrees, no longer tracking center mass. Reyes didn't resist any of it. He sat where they'd found him, swaying slightly, and let a Kael'th medic, a species he had, 8 months earlier, killed 43 individuals of, cut away the ruined suit fabric around his leg and pack the wound with foam sealant, watching the process with the distant, uninvested attention of a man observing something happening to someone else. You could have run further, Rahl said, crouching in front of him while Thess worked. It wasn't a question. He wasn't sure why he said it at all, except that the silence in the crater had started to feel like it needed something in it. Reyes's eyes moved to him, slow, unfocused, then sharpened for a moment with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Ships gone. Legs gone. Arms? He glanced down at the immobile shoulder without much interest. Not doing great either. Where exactly did you figure I was running to, Sergeant? You could have died fighting, Rahl said. Every file we have on Threnna Vale says that's what you do. Something shifted behind the human's eyes. Not fear, not defiance. Something quieter and harder to name. Gone before Rahl could pin it down. Threnna Vale's not what you think it was, Reyes said. His voice, thin as it was, had gone flat in a way that made Rahl's instincts prickle, though he couldn't have said why. 43 dead, Rahl said. I know exactly what it was. Thess, still working the sealant foam into the wound with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of a field medic, glanced sideways at Rahl without breaking rhythm. Sergeant, you want me to keep him talking? Command's going to want everything he's willing to give before he's processed. Easier to get it now, while he's soft, than after some interrogation team spends a week hardening him back up. Rahl considered it. Somewhere in the last 20 minutes, the mission had stopped feeling like an extraction and started feeling like something else. A conversation neither side had planned to have, in a place neither side had planned to have it. Reyes, he said. You said Threnna Vale wasn't what we think it was. I'm listening if you want to say more. The human's eyes opened again, slow, and for a moment he seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Not the frozen crater, not the ring of armored hunters, but 8 months and several systems away, in a place none of them could follow him. There was a diplomatic mission, he said finally. Real one. Genuine olive branch. First real contact talks between my people and yours in a decade. Your command sent 43 soldiers to secure the compound. Standard protocol, nothing unusual about it. He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. What your command didn't tell those 43 soldiers, because your command didn't know either, was that the compound had already been compromised 3 days earlier by a faction on my side that didn't want the talks to happen. Not my people, not officially. The kind of faction that exists in every war, on every side, that profits when the war keeps going. You're telling me your own people sabotaged the talks. I'm telling you the hostages taken that day were human, Reyes said. Diplomats. Support staff. 2 kids who shouldn't have been anywhere near a war zone but were there because their mother worked translation. Your 43 soldiers walked into that compound to secure a peace conference and instead walked into a hostage extraction nobody had briefed them for, against people wearing Kelth-adjacent gear specifically so that if it went wrong, it would look exactly like what your assembly's official record says it looks like. He exhaled, slow and ragged. I was already in the building. Off the books, personal protection detail for the diplomatic lead, because she was my sister and I didn't trust anyone else's security to actually care whether she came home. By the time I understood what was happening, there wasn't a version of that day that ended without bodies in it. I made sure most of them weren't hers. The crater was silent except for the faint hiss of Thess's sealant applicator. Rahl found he had nothing readily available to say to that. No protocol, no training scenario, nothing in 11 years of service that told him what to do with a confession that reframed the worst atrocity of his professional life as a tragedy with a shape he hadn't been shown. That's not in any report we have, he said finally. No, Reyes agreed. It wouldn't be. It's not exactly flattering to either side. Your assembly gets a clean villain and a reason to keep funding border patrols. My command gets a hero story and 43 enemy dead to point to when they need to remind people what's at stake. Nobody in a position to write the official version had any reason to complicate it with the truth, and I was in no state to argue with either of them from a hospital bed with half my blood replaced. He looked at Rahl, steady despite the exhaustion dragging at every line of his face. I'm not telling you this so you'll like me, Sergeant. I don't expect that, and I don't think I've earned it. I'm telling you because in about 30 minutes, something is going to happen that's going to matter a lot more than whether you believe my version of one bad day, and I'd rather you go into it knowing I've got no reason left to lie to you. Sure, Reyes said, and closed his eyes, and didn't say anything else. The shuttle took 40 minutes to arrive, and in that time something strange settled over the crater. Not quite peace, but its rough approximation, the particular quiet of people who have been braced for violence for so long that its absence feels like its own kind of pressure. Rahl kept his squad in formation around the human, weapons still ready, discipline still intact, but the atmosphere had shifted from hunt to vigil, and everyone in the crater seemed to feel it happening in real time and not quite know what to do about it. Van, who had lost a cousin, ended up sitting nearest to Reyes while Tess finished the leg splint, and Raul watched him with some care, half expecting the young officer's restraint to give out. Instead, Van asked, in the stiff, careful Kael'th standard that most of the squad used when addressing prisoners, "Why didn't you fight us? You had the training. You had the reputation. 11 of us, and you didn't even try." Reyes's laugh was a dry, cracked sound with almost nothing behind it. 11 of you, he said, with a rail cannon on Overwatch and a full perimeter and 6 weeks of prep. You want to know why I didn't fight? He tipped his head back against the ice, eyes on the black sky where the gas giant hung fat and orange above the crater rim. Because fighting was never the plan, kid. Fighting was never once the plan. Raul, listening from a few meters off, felt something in the back of his skull go very still and very cold, the way it had once when a bomb disposal tech on Threll had told him, calmly, that the device in front of them was already armed. "Explain that," Raul said. Reyes turned his head, slow, exhausted, and looked at him with an expression Raul would spend a long time afterward trying to categorize. Not triumph, not mockery, something closer to genuine, weary regret. "You should probably check your shuttle's approach vector," Reyes said, "before it lands." Thess was the one who caught it, 30 seconds later, running a fast diagnostic on the incoming shuttle's telemetry out of pure reflex rather than any specific alarm, and went very quiet on the comm channel in a way that made every hunter in the crater turn toward him at once. "Sergeant," Thess said, "the shuttle's not answering hails." "Say again." "I'm reading the transponder. It's ours. IFF checks out clean. But nobody's answering the channel and..." A pause, the sound of fast typing. "Sergeant, the flight path doesn't match what we called in. It's not coming down at the LZ. It's coming down on top of our position." Raul's mind, trained through 11 years and a dozen worlds to move fast under pressure, ran the numbers before his instincts had finished catching up. A courier ship that had crashed too neatly, in a search grid too convenient, at the mouth of a lava tube that offered clean sight lines from 3 directions and cover from none of them. A formation that, now that Raul thought about it with the cold clarity of a man realizing he'd been looking at a trap the whole time and mistaking it for a battlefield, had walked his entire squad into a bowl-shaped crater with exactly one route in and one route out. "He's not the target," Raul said slowly, the words coming out of him before he'd fully assembled the thought behind them. "He's the bait." Reyes, still sitting against the ice with a shattered leg and a ruined arm, looked almost sorry about it. "For what it's worth," he said, "the leg's real. The arm's real. Nothing about the last 6 weeks was faked. You hunted me exactly as hard as you think you did, and I ran exactly as scared as I looked because until about 40 minutes ago, I genuinely didn't know if my own people were going to make it in time." He shifted, wincing, against the ice. "I want you to understand that. It matters later. This wasn't a performance. It just also wasn't the whole story." "The whole story," Raul said. Weapon coming back up to full readiness. Every hunter in the crater doing the same in the space of a single breath. "Being what exactly?" "Threnna Vale wasn't a massacre," Reyes said. "It was a rescue mission that went sideways, and 43 of your people died because your command sent them into a hostage situation without telling them what they were walking into. I was the one who walked out. Command back home decided that made me useful, not as a weapon, as a distraction. Something big and bloody and famous enough that if they let word spread, if they made sure the story got exaggerated in exactly the right ways through exactly the right channels, your assembly would spend 6 months and half a fleet's black budget chasing one man across 4 systems instead of noticing what the rest of us were actually doing in that time." The crater was very quiet. Somewhere above, the shuttle, not a shuttle, Raul understood now, watching its trajectory light up red on his HUD as it dropped below the ridge line and resolved into something with too many weapon hardpoints for a medical transport, began its final approach. "You're telling me," Raul said, very carefully, keeping his voice level through a professional discipline that felt, for the first time in his career, like the only thing standing between him and something closer to panic, that 6 weeks of manhunt, the single largest resource commitment this assembly has made to one target in a decade, was a diversion. "I'm telling you," Reyes said, That you spent 6 weeks and 11 of your best hunters chasing a decoy, while my people quietly finished retrofitting a strike group 2 systems over, and that the ship coming down on top of you right now isn't here to extract me. It's here to make sure there isn't a squad left standing that can report what they saw when they found me." He met Rawl's eyes, and there was no triumph in it at all, only that same tired, genuine regret. "I really am sorry, Sergeant. You didn't do anything wrong. You just weren't fighting the war you thought you were fighting." For 1 full second, Rawl Dosketh stood very still in the freezing dark of a nameless moon, 11 years of training and discipline holding his body steady while his mind raced through every version of the next 60 seconds and found almost none of them survivable, and felt, underneath the fear, a strange and furious clarity, the particular sharpness that came only at the exact moment a hunter realized, too late, that somewhere in the last 6 weeks, without ever noticing the shift, he had stopped being the one holding the leash. "Scatter," he said into the squad channel, already moving, already shouting orders that 11 exhausted hunters obeyed on pure reflex because there was no time left to do anything else. "Scatter and take cover, that ship is not." The crater lit up white. When Rawl opened his eyes again, he was lying against the crater wall roughly 30 meters from where he'd been standing, his suit's emergency systems screaming warnings across a HUD that flickered in and out with damage, his ears full of a ringing silence that told him his suit's audio pickups had taken a hard hit and hadn't fully recovered. He forced himself upright against a body that did not want to cooperate, and the first thing he saw, through smoke and drifting ice crystals lit orange by the burning wreck of what had, indeed, turned out to be a heavily modified strike craft rather than a rescue shuttle, was Yoon dragging Van behind a shelf of ice, both of them alive, both of them moving. Thess was up on one knee near the crater's south wall, weapon already reacquiring targets. Not everyone had made it. Rawl's HUD flashed 2 names in the grim red-bordered box reserved for confirmed losses, and he made himself look at them for exactly as long as discipline required before pushing the grief down into the place where a soldier learned to keep it during active engagement. But the squad, battered and burned and furious, was still a squad, still fighting, still alive in numbers that should not, by any reasonable calculation, have survived a strike craft's opening salvo. At that range. Because the strike craft's opening salvo, Rawl understood dimly as the smoke cleared enough to see the wreck properly, had not actually hit the crater floor. It had hit the strike craft itself. A clean, precise detonation that had gutted the ship from the inside before it ever got close enough to bring its weapons to bear on the hunters below. Elias Reyes was still sitting exactly where they'd left him, against the mouth of the lava tube, one hand pressed to the ice, watching the burning wreckage with an expression that had, for the first time since they'd found him, something almost like relief in it. "Small device," he said, when Rawl limped close enough to hear him over the ringing in his own ears, his translated voice thin and worn but steady. "Sewn into the lining of my suit, keyed to a proximity trigger and a transponder signature I memorized 8 months ago. I've been carrying it since before Threnna Vale. Commands contingency, in case the diversion plan ever got far enough that the strike group had to move without me being able to warn anyone in time." He looked up at Rawl, and something in his ruined, exhausted face had gone very quiet. "I wasn't supposed to use it like this. I was supposed to let it happen and trust my own side's math that a squad of 11 Kael'th hunters was an acceptable loss against the value of the diversion holding a few days longer." "But you didn't," Rawl said. "It wasn't quite a question." "You didn't kill me when you had every reason to," Reyes said. "You patched my leg. You called in a medevac for a man who murdered 43 of your people because for about 10 minutes back there, you looked at me and decided I wasn't a monster anymore, I was just a casualty. Something to be handled with a little decency instead of a lot of violence." He shook his head slowly, wincing at the movement. "I've spent 8 months being the reason people justify doing terrible things to each other. I wasn't going to spend the last conscious minutes of a mission being the reason 11 more of you died for a war you didn't start and don't even know you're fighting." Rawl crouched in front of him again, the way he had before the sky lit up white, and found that the fury he'd carried for 6 weeks, the fury he'd already, somewhere in the last hour, felt drain into something quieter, had not come back. What replaced it was something far more complicated. Not trust, not forgiveness, but a kind of grim, exhausted respect for a man who had, in the space of one impossible hour, been both the bait in a trap set by his own side and the reason that trap hadn't closed. "You're still my prisoner," Rahl said. "I know," Reyes said. "You're going to answer for Threnna Vale. Whatever the truth of it turns out to be. I know that too. But you're not going in the report as a target we neutralized," Rahl said, surprising himself slightly with how certain the words came out. "You're going in as a man who told the truth when it would have been easier not to, and who used a weapon meant to kill my squad to save it instead. I don't know what that makes you. I don't think I'm the one who gets to decide that. But it's not nothing, and it's going in the file exactly like it happened." Something moved across Reyes's face. Not gratitude exactly, something too tired and too complicated for a word that simple, but close enough to it that Rahl understood, watching it, that he had said the right thing. "Copy that, Sergeant," Reyes said, and let his head fall back against the ice, eyes finally sliding shut, not from resignation this time but from something closer to permission. The particular, hard-won stillness of a man who had spent 6 weeks running and 8 months carrying a truth no one had wanted to hear, and had finally, in the wreckage of a trap that had almost killed the people hunting him, been allowed to put it down. 6 hours later, aboard the medical bay of the Kael'th cruiser Devatha's Mercy, Rahl Dosketh stood at the observation window outside a containment ward and watched a human sleep under a tangle of monitoring leads and stabilizer clamps, his shattered leg set in a resin cast, his shoulder rebuilt by surgeons who had never before operated on human anatomy and had spent 4 tense hours doing it from a medical database hastily requisitioned from 3 systems away. Behind him, General Vosk Thaird's voice came through the comm, tight and furious and disbelieving in equal measure, demanding to know how a 6-week manhunt for a war criminal had ended with a destroyed strike craft, 2 dead hunters, and a prisoner who was, according to Rahl's preliminary report, to be treated as something closer to a defector than a captive. Rahl let the general finish. Then he said, quietly, watching the slow, even rise and fall of a sleeping man's chest through reinforced glass. "Sir, 6 weeks ago, I was told to hunt a monster. I found a man who'd been carrying a war he didn't choose on his own back for 8 months, and who had 100 better reasons to let my squad die tonight than to save us. I don't know yet what that makes him, but I know what it doesn't make him, and it isn't a monster. I'd like that on record before anyone above my pay grade decides what happens to him next." There was a long silence on the other end of the channel, the particular weighted silence of a superior officer recalculating an entire operation in real time. "Understood, Sergeant," General Thaird said finally, gruff and unreadable. "Get some rest. We'll sort out the rest of it in the morning." Rahl stayed at the window a while longer after the channel closed, watching the human sleep, thinking about 43 names he had memorized out of duty and a strike craft that had died before it ever got the chance to kill his squad, and found that the hunt he had carried for 6 weeks across 4 systems had ended not with the satisfaction of a kill or the relief of a capture, but with something stranger and heavier and, in its own way, more honest, the particular uneasy weight of having gone looking for a monster and come home instead with a man. It was not, he thought, watching the steady rhythm of the monitors through the glass, the ending anyone had prepared him for. It was, he suspected, going to matter a great deal more than the one they'd expected. Reyes woke a full day later, groggy under a haze of Kael'th sedatives that had never been calibrated for human physiology and had, according to the medical staff, come closer than anyone liked to stopping his heart twice during the night. Rahl was there when it happened, not because protocol required it. A squad of junior officers would have satisfied the guard rotation just as well, but because some part of him, the part that had spent 6 weeks memorizing a stranger's habits well enough to predict his next move, had found he wanted to be the first face the man saw. "You look terrible," Reyes rasped, when his eyes finally focused enough to find Rahl's across the containment ward. "You looked worse 3 days ago," Rahl said. "Kept trying to die on us. Rude, considering how much trouble we'd gone to catching you." Something that might, on a human face, have been the ghost of a real laugh moved across Reyes's cracked lips. "Sergeant Dosketh," he said, "I owe you an apology. I don't think either of us is going to feel finished after I give it. 2 of your people didn't make it out of that crater. That's on the plan I was part of, whatever I did or didn't intend by the end of it." "Van and Coral," Rahl said. He'd said the names out loud exactly once since the report went in, at the small, formal ceremony the squad had held in the cruiser's forward bay, and saying them again now cost him something he hadn't expected it to cost. Van had a cousin at Threnna Vale. Spent 6 weeks telling anyone who'd listen exactly what he planned to do when we found you. Ended up being the one who sat closest to you while Thess set your leg. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time there was nothing performed in it, nothing calculated for effect. Just the flat, exhausted weight of a man adding one more name to a list he was clearly going to be carrying for a long time. "I don't have anything that makes that better. I'm not going to pretend I do." "No," Rahl agreed. "You don't. But you didn't let that strike craft finish what it started, either. And I've had a day and a half to think about which of those two facts I'm supposed to weigh heavier, and I still don't have a clean answer." He pulled a chair from the corner of the ward and sat, close enough to the bed that the conversation could stay quiet, private, the kind of exchange that wouldn't make it into any official transcript. "General Thaird wants to know why a sergeant with 11 years of clean service filed a report recommending diplomatic protections for a war criminal instead of a straightforward transfer to military tribunal. I told him I didn't have language for what you are yet, and that I wasn't going to pretend I did just to make the paperwork simpler." "What do you think I am?" Reyes asked. It didn't sound like a challenge. It sounded, Rahl thought, like a genuine question from a man who had spent 8 months being told exactly what he was by people who had never once asked him. Rahl considered it for a long time before he answered, turning the question over the way he might have turned over an unfamiliar weapon, checking it from every angle before deciding how much weight to put behind it. "I think you're the first thing I've hunted that turned out to be more complicated once I caught it," he said finally. "I think that's probably true of most things worth hunting. And I think it took me 6 weeks and a strike craft trying to kill my whole squad to actually learn it instead of just believing I already knew it." He stood, the chair scraping softly against the deck plating, and looked down at the human who had cost his people 2 lives and saved the rest of them in the same impossible hour. "You're going to answer for what happened one way or another. Your people's version and mine are going to fight over exactly how, and I imagine that's going to take longer than either of us wants it to. But you're not a monster, Reyes. I stopped believing that the moment I found you kneeling in that crater instead of fighting your way out of it, and nothing that happened after has given me a reason to go back to believing it. That's not forgiveness. I don't think I'm the one with the authority to give you that, even if I wanted to. But it's the truth, as best as I've got it, and I thought you should hear someone say it out loud." He left the ward without waiting for a response, because there wasn't one that would have changed anything, and because some conversations were better left to sit unfinished, the way most true ones were. Behind him, through the reinforced glass, Elias Reyes watched him go, and did not close his eyes again for a long time. The end.